Hey guys, wanted to make a quick video to explain how to switch out this bypass valve for the Supercharger kit. This is the Edelbrock Supercharger kit for the Subaru BRZ, Scion FRS, Toyota 86. So basically the story behind these is that there's this bypass valve that's pre-installed on the kit. This is what you see right here is actually the new one. You could tell it has 2 bolts. The old one has 3 bolts on it, and it is actually quite a bit smaller. You can see it right here. That's what it looks like. That's the old style. What people were finding is that they were getting damaged and having to replace them, so finally Edelbrock put this new one on all new kits except for mine, unfortunately, which they included the old style. So they basically, if that happens to you, you just have to send them an email, contact tech support. Well, call them, don't email them because they never respond, but call them and they should be able to send this new one out to you at no charge. So let's go over quickly roughly what the install instructions are, and kind of explain. Obviously mine's already installed, so not going to take it off and show you how to do it, but I actually am going to adjust it because it's not quite adjusted the right way after talking to tech support. I mean, it's probably okay, but it's just to be safe, I'm going to make a minor adjustment. So I'll go over what I'm doing and explain how it works. So first of all, the first step is obviously to take off the whole supercharger off the car. Mine never was on the car, so that was easy. The second, beyond that, you basically just have to remove this guy. Basically, the first step is to try to remove these 3 bolts right here, but you'll see that on mine, actually 2 of them did not come off. I was only able to get 1 off, but I was still able to pull the whole bracket and assembly off. I think if you put some force on this nut and push it off and while you're trying to loosen it, that might work. I was able to get it off. It's just these nylon nuts sometimes don't come off. So once you have this off, you basically take this guy off first, then you take the bracket off. I believe that's the right order. But basically then the first thing you're going to do is install this bracket with these 2 bolts loosely, not actually tightening them down. And then you install this guy onto the brackets. You put it through the hole right there, and then this is going to key in to this little lever right here. There's a key that this actuator lever goes through, and you're just going to slide that in, tighten these 2 bolts right here. Again, remembering that these guys are loose. So that I think that corresponds to something like step 7, I think, in the install instructions. And then what you're going to do is you'll notice that these nuts actually, or these bolts aren't very accessible. You can see, especially this top one on the top right is not accessible with this little lever. So basically what you have to do is you have to actuate this valve to be able to open it up all the way. And there's really 2 points of doing that. One is to move this out of the way so you can actually tighten these 2 bolts, but more importantly is to actually adjust this lever. So what happens is this rod right down here is actually what's going to be flipping the butterfly valve inside of the supercharger itself. So you basically want to adjust that to 2 points. The first point of adjusting this bracket back and forth is to basically set the open position for this butterfly valve inside of the supercharger itself. And then once you have that set, then you basically do the fine adjustment, which I'll talk about. But basically the important thing is you never want to actually move this physically with your hand because you could damage the internals of this bypass valve. So what you have to do is get a vacuum pump. This guy is just a rental from AutoZone. It's actually really crappy, and I read when I was reading reviews about them, apparently the green one that you get is really not very good. But fortunately all it came with was this clear tube and the green gun, and the clear tube just happened to mate up just fine. So basically what you want to do is you want to actuate this pump, and that'll actually open this completely. And as you can see now that that's open, you can access those bolts just fine. And just to give you another view, this would be really hard to see. Let me go ahead and get... Okay, so here's I still have the cellophane on because my kit was brand new, but you can see that right in there, that gold piece is the butterfly valve. So that's basically completely open, and then you can still sort of see it. And then once you release the valve, it closes. So you can see that that's kind of basically how this works. So basically, once this thing is under vacuum, it's going to open up that valve. The air is going to flow in here. It's going to bypass the supercharger and go straight into the intake manifold. And then vice versa, when it's closed, it's going to go through the supercharger and then in through the intake manifold. So basically, with the way that mine is adjusted, just to go through the rest of the procedure, basically, after you have this bracket set up and you have that valve open, then what you do is you release that vacuum, and then you're going to install this set screw assembly, which is just a threaded rod. There's a little Allen head on this side, and then you're going to basically set the stop point for this guy. And the way you do that is you stick a feeler gauge inside there, inside the gap between the butterfly valve and the bore, which is obviously not possible because you can't put anything in there. I mean, there's no way you can possibly fit anything in there. So I don't really know what Edelbrock was thinking when they wrote the instructions, because what they say in the instructions is physically not possible. So the way I did it, which I think is reasonable, and I think tech support kind of agreed with me, basically what you're going to do is you're going to, before you take anything off, so just pretend this is the 3-bolt version. So when you get it, it was in this position. Basically what I did was, the first thing I did was I loosened this gem nut. And then I got my Allen wrench and started to loosen this set screw. And I did that very carefully, and I counted exactly how many turns I had to turn this set screw until it backed out. And very, very carefully, about a quarter turn at a time, and just marked down each quarter turn until I got a nice little gap between the set screw and this bracket right here. And then what I did was I used a feeler gauge set, and I tried the different sizes. And what I did is I basically slid this feeler gauge in between that gap right there, and I tried every single one until I got a nice fit. But it has to be, just barely goes in and out. If you can fit a lot of feeler gauges in there, because if you'll notice that if you go too thick, it'll actually push this bracket that way a little bit as you're sliding it in the gap. So you want it just to barely go in and out, and that gives you a reference point. So for me, it was 0.011 inches between the set screw and this bracket. And so now I know that gap is exactly 0.11 inches, and if I want to actuate this guy that way, all I have to do is, when I install this new guy, so now I've installed this whole new assembly, I just need to actuate this guy so that it's rotated at the same angle that it came from the factory. So to do that, I basically close this guy down, I screw it down until it's very, very close. I put my feeler gauge in there and basically screw this down until it touches the feeler gauge, and the feeler gauge is nice and loose. Same feel, basically, that it came from the factory. Then I take out the feeler gauge. Then I actuate this guy, get it out of the way so I'm not actually moving this as I'm tightening the set screw. So it's actuated, and then I turn this guy exactly the same number of turns that I counted when I loosened it. So for me, that was 1.5 turns. So again, feeler gauge 0.011 inches, then I knew I'm exactly 1.5 turns off from where it was at the factory. I screw it in, and then that actuates this guy. And by basically measuring the gap between this bracket and the end of the set screw, this guy is always in the same position. The bracket can move back and forth. It doesn't matter. All I'm doing is I'm basically getting a reference point from where this guy is resting, and that's basically correlating to when the blade is completely closed in the bore. And then I'm just backing it off by that same amount by moving the set screw this way. I'm actuating this guy open, and then it's basically just opening the bore just ever so slightly to the same position it was calibrated from the factory. So hopefully that makes sense. I did that, and then my question for tech support was, as I actuate this guy, you'll see there's actually a little like raised bubble on this bracket. So as you actuate this lever is actually going to swing down and it's going to touch that bubble. If that's apparent. So you can see that that end of that lever is touching the bubble. And let me do it more at full speed. But when it actuates, you'll actually hear it click as it hits the bubble. Listen. Okay, well, it didn't do it that time. Let's try it one more time. Hear that click? So it clicked because it hit that bubble. So I think that the lever arm was actually hitting the bubble and getting stopped before it really should have stopped. And actually, if you pump it again, sometimes the lever arm will actually bounce off. See, it kind of came out a little bit. And so you could tell it's not quite at the full actuation point. So I was concerned that this little bit of stoppage there was going to potentially cause some stress on this valve. So I asked tech support, and he said that it was probably okay, and that this guy would probably self-center over time as it keeps getting pulled vacuum. But he said to be safe, you could take a crescent wrench and put it on this guy and just tweak it a little and bend it out of the way. But he said it'd probably be better just to actually readjust this bracket. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to loosen these two guys. With this at its full actuation, I'm going to slide the bracket forward just ever so slightly, and what that's going to do is it's going to rotate this guy up a little. So instead of, right now I have it adjusted so that it's basically this little tab right here is perfectly horizontal, and I'm going to actuate or move the bracket to the right, and that's going to force this guy to rotate slightly clockwise. And what that's going to do is it's going to create the bore itself, the blade itself is now not going to be in the fully open position. It's actually going to start to slightly close, but it's not that big of a deal, right? Because it just vacuum. The thing doesn't have to be perfectly vertical in the bore for the vacuum, for the air to bypass. Plus, the car's under vacuum, so who cares if there's air going to the intake manifold in that position, because you're not on the throttle anyway. So it's not really a performance issue, I think. And he actually said that the Honda Civic kit, I think they actually spec it to the technicians to turn it at 70 degrees, not even 90 degrees from the factory. So that would be, imagine this guy rotated another 20 degrees. And I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do a little bit so that when I actuate it, it's not contacting this bubble here. So that's basically the concept here. I'm going to actuate a little bit so that it's not hitting this bubble when it's in the full vacuum. And then what I'll have to do is I'll have to back out the set screw again, loosen this guy up, redo what I described with my feeler gauge, and then get that gap once this bracket's in this new position, and then just torque down, or not torque down, but move the set screw back to the left and do the 6 turns like I described before. So that's basically what I'm going to do now, just to get this off of that bubble, and then it should be, probably at like 85 degrees in the full open position, and then in the closed position it'll be the same what it is from the factory. Again, I think that's the best way to do it given the instructions, and they don't really have good instructions. Edelbrock said this isn't rocket science, but I'm over-analytical, so that's what I get for being over-analytical. But I think this is probably a good way to do it. Tech support basically said to feel it out, and you can definitely feel it, as you're doing the set screw, but, maybe if you've adjusted thousands of superchargers, it's obvious, but if you never adjusted a bypass valve before, it may not be completely obvious where to go. So yeah, that's how I'm going to attack mine. We'll see how it goes, and hopefully this is helpful to people who have to replace this bypass valve. So yeah, have a good one. Okay, here we go. Here's the result of what I just did. Basically, I loosened these two guys up really, just a little tiny bit, and then I shifted the whole bracket to the right, and you see now, as I actuate this guy, so part of that clicking noise may have actually been just the bypass valve itself, but you can see at least now that gap, pumping it all the way. You can see it's like minus 20 inch of mercury. It's not anywhere close to that bubble. So at least it makes my I feel a little more safe that it's not getting stopped prematurely by this little bubble on the bracket. So another thing I didn't say is once you do have it set, you can torque down both of these guys. There's no torque spec for it, so I just did it tight, but then you can take one out at a time, put some blue Loctite on, and put them back in. So yeah, and then this is, so it's not actually, the set screw itself is not actually adjusted, so you could see that gap. So what you'd want to do is just take your Allen wrench and screw it in, etc., etc., etc. Hit that 0.11 inch with a feeler gauge, again, like this. I can't do it with one hand, but anyways, you would get to that point and then actuate and then turn your 1.5, throw down, screw down the jam nut, and you're done. And that's like the whole procedure. But I'm not going to do that yet because I still have to put some more blue Loctite on these guys. But if I actuate it all the way, this is fully open. You can see if you go in here and look in there, you know, it's basically fully open still. It's probably like 85 degrees. Just a hair away from full open, just so I'm not hitting that bracket. So that was basically the way I decided to calibrate mine, and we'll see if there's any issues. You can see that this little tab is not perfectly horizontal anymore. Actually, I think when I received it from the factory, this thing was actually quite a bit higher, so I think it's fine. I think it's going to be just okay, and then, you know, we'll see how things go. All right, thanks.